believe there is something transformative for virtually everybody if more of the planet comes within reach. And the internet did that digitally, and supersonic flight can do it physically.
All right, I am here very happy today to have an incredible guest, Blake Scholl of Boom Supersonic. Blake, I can't thank you enough for coming on. How are you doing today?
Doing great. It's good to see you, Chris, and I'm excited for this conversation.
Well, we were talking before we came on about how nice it is to do a podcast interview where we don't get asked all the same questions. But I do have to ask one of the same questions, which is, can you give people the 30-second overview of Boom Supersonic, just in case somebody's under a rock and they haven't heard of it?
Yeah, so we are building the supersonic passenger airliner that we hope all of you will fly on in the not too distant future. So think across the Atlantic in 3 or 4 hours, across the Pacific, like Seattle, Tokyo in like 4.5 hours. Being able to do it at business class kind of fares, and ultimately our goal is to make high speed flight available for anybody and make the world more accessible.
Yeah, I think that that was an excellent summary. And as somebody who just this year alone has traveled to both Brazil and Bangkok and Saudi Arabia, I am one of the people who is eagerly awaiting the rollout of the Overture Supersonic Airline because it would make my life a hell of a lot easier. Those 13, 14-hour flight legs are not easy.
Yeah, it's just absolutely brutal. And I think there are a whole lot of people who are excited, and we just can't get this done fast enough.
Now, one of the things, just to emphasize why this is so important, one of the things I heard you say in one of your interviews, I think it was with Avichal, was just explaining how Hawaii travel completely changed once the jet airline came in. Maybe you can just briefly tell that story because I think it really hammers home why what you're doing is so important.
A lot of people think that speed is about saving time or going really fast, kind of, Top Gun style. And I deeply believe that it's about unlocking possibilities in the world and that we go places, do things, connect with people in different ways when time is not a barrier. So Hawaii is one of my favorite examples. It was basically not a tourist destination before the advent of the jet because it just took 16, 17 hours to get to from most of the US, and most people couldn't afford the time to get there. And in the first 10 years of the jet age, when those flights shrunk to the 6 to 8 hours that they are today, travel to Hawaii went up sixfold, and it kept growing at double-digit percentages compounded annually for several decades as we started to build hotels and resorts and tourist attractions, and there kind of became more reasons to go.
Yeah, and that illustrates one of the things that you say that I think is so wise, which is that with technologies, with startups, it's the second order effects that really cause the major consequences. In the case of Hawaii, it's like, oh, we can get to Hawaii faster. And the consequence of that
Yeah,
is not just, oh, I can go visit Hawaii, it's that the entire state transforms as it becomes a major tourist destination.
yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, a supersonic flight, the first order effect is, oh, the flights are shorter, you could save some time. But the second order effects is, where do we do business? Where do we vacation? Even who we can fall in love with. What happens culturally when our kids grow up in a world where they've met people from every continent, broken bread with them, not just read about them in textbooks or watched them on YouTube videos. The second order, third order effects of that are incredibly exciting.
And frankly, from an investor perspective, to me, that makes me more long-term bullish on, for example, Latin America, because all of a sudden, Latin America becomes something that's relatively easy to reach. Right now, it's hard. To get to Brazil, I have to take multiple flights. It takes forever. But what makes Latin America interesting, besides its geographic location, is the time zones. Right? I don't have to worry about shifting all the time zones I do going to Europe, going to Asia, going to the Middle East. Latin America, it's just the timing of the flight itself. And so I can easily see a dramatic increase in travel between the United States and Latin America and South America.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as a thought experiment, this is not where we are on day one, but as a thought experiment to get yourself into the right mindset, imagine what if we could get anywhere in the world in 4 hours for a fare so low that you don't think about spending the money. How would you live? How would you work? Who would you know? And I think that is the future. It'll take us decades to get there. That is the future, and I think it's an incredibly exciting future.
I love the sound of it, and I'm already excited just hearing about it. Now, let's dial back and go back to the beginning with one of the things that I love to do with guests, which is to sort of ask them a little bit about how they grew up. So I know you grew up in the Cincinnati area, And I'm curious how your experiences growing up contributed to who you are today and still shape how you do things.
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in a kind of upper middle class family in Cincinnati. And as I think about aviation, it was in my childhood in various ways. My parents tell me that when I was 6 months old, they took me to the local airport, watching Cessnas take off and land. And that was the first time I made a connection between a toy thing and a real thing. And so I don't know, maybe it imprinted. I remember in high school being jealous of my friends who got to take flying lessons. But it never occurred to me to have aviation be part of my career. I think because it was just so implicitly obvious that innovation was happening elsewhere. And so I played around with software from a really early age. Was coding, had my first startup in my parents' basement in high school in a very, very basic sense of startup. And loved flight, but never thought about it being something I would work on aside from just drawing cartoons in a sketchbook.
I do want to mention one quick thing, which you glossed over quickly, which is that you were an entrepreneur in high school. You had a services company that you sold because you're the rare entrepreneur who's not a college dropout. You're a high school dropout. You dropped out of high school to go to college, and that's when you sold your first company.
Yeah, I did not enjoy high school, and Carnegie Mellon had this, in my view, brilliant program where you could basically apply as a junior, write an essay about why high school sucks and why there's nothing left for you there, then you could pass a maturity test, and if you did, they would just treat you like anybody else applying, and if your SAT scores were good, you didn't have to have a high school diploma, you didn't have to get your GED. And so I did that. And as I was going through that process, I called Stanford, I called MIT, I called UIUC, and I was like, "Hey, would you guys take me a year early?" And they're like, "What? No, call us back in a year, dude." So I went to CMU without really finishing high school, and I look back and feel like it's like one of the best things I ever did.
Well, I got to agree with you. We took a slightly different path to get there, but this is one of the ways that we're alike. We're not that far apart in age, about about 7 years or so, actually, because we're both young for our age, as I like to say. But I had skipped a couple of grades to jump from middle school to high school early, and so that let me go to Stanford when I was 15. I didn't have to say, "Oh, I'm a high school dropout. Will you take me?" But you do have to overcome that whole maturity testing. People think, "Oh, just because you're 15 or 16, you can't go to college," and the answer is, well, it depends on the 15 or 16-year-old.
I think that's right. In some ways, I don't really know how I passed the maturity test, but they let me come on campus and just treated me like every other freshman, and I don't think I caused too much havoc.
Well, obviously, you studied and did great at CMU. I believe you graduated early. Is that right?
Yeah, I did CMU in 3 years. I was very excited to get kind of back into the real world and work and build things.
Yeah. And then obviously, as you mentioned, you had this entire first career in the software world, which included being a founder. You also worked with a fellow I worked with a long time ago when I was at DE Shaw, Jeff Holden, brilliant guy, brilliant entrepreneur, and I think a mentor of yours. And then you ended up, after starting your company, which was Kima Labs, it ended up being acquired by Groupon. Now, tell me about how you ended up starting Kima Labs, because we know you have this love of aviation, we know you have this love of all things, and then you end up
Mhm.
working on internet coupons. So how did that go about? How did the mission of the company tie in with what you were looking to do?
Um, I think I did basically everything wrong, to be honest. I spent 5-ish years at Amazon, another kind of 5-ish years at Jeff Holden's startup. I was the first employee, and when I left Amazon, I was planning to start my own thing. I got talked into joining Jeff instead, which I'm glad I did. But I still had that itch in me. I'm like, okay, I want to go back and build my own stuff. And the way I thought about it was, okay, I know e-commerce from my time at Amazon. I know mobile from my time at Pelago, which back then was like the first iPhone company, if you can remember that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought I should work on mobile e-commerce, and because like clearly I know this. So I was starting with what I knew, not what I wanted to exist in the world. And we figured there had to be something there. thought about kind of what could we build that would people would use when they're shopping in a store, and we did all the things that were trendy and fashionable at the time. We put game mechanics in it, and I never stopped to think, I hate shopping in stores. I'm an e-commerce nerd. Who am I building this for? Why do I have any product intuition? And so, we built this thing called Barcode Hero, which was I can't even say this with a straight face. It was a barcode scanning game. And, it got a little bit of traction, but it turned out there was really no there, unsurprisingly. And then because we weren't starting with a whole lot of vision and we weren't building for ourselves, we had like no idea where to go next. And so we pivoted that company like 3 times. And, we succeeded in shipping, well-built iPhone apps with, well-built web services and websites that went with them. But we didn't succeed in building anything that anybody loved. And I think our final pivot was towards like a mobile one-click checkout kind of a thing. We were calling Tap Buy, and it was like, okay, we could raise another seed round, keep going with that. But it was just a grind, a total grind. And my co-founder was going to leave, and I would get up in the morning and think, why did I get myself into this thing? And so when we had a chance to basically do an acqui-hire at a Groupon, and this is back when it was possible to do those in a relatively flush kind of way, and the investors were going to make money, and I was going to make a little money, and but mostly it was like, oh, it's like my escape fantasy. I get out of this startup that I hate, that I have this burden of responsibility to my employees and to my investors for, and so I just kind of pulled the handles on the ejection seat and punched out.
Yeah, well, and that's very Top Gun Maverick, something that I'm sure we'll turn to at some point in time. But I know exactly how you feel. You start a company based on your experience and what you're good at and what you already know. And that's the very McKinsey kind of approach to it. But there's a reason why McKinsey isn't known as the fountain of startups,
Mhm.
right? It's not something that you loved. It's not something that you really wanted. It's not something that you wanted to do. And in fact, I mean, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth. I don't think so. You felt trapped. You felt like you're trapped by the responsibility. You'd agreed to start this company. You'd taken money from investors. You brought people onto your team, and you're like, I can't quit on them, but God, I wish I were
That's
out of here.
exactly right. I felt totally trapped. It was psychologically incredibly difficult for me. Like I'd wake up in the morning like deeply depressed about like how in the world did I get out of this thing, and I think I'm just going to crash it, and then no one will ever want to invest in me again, et cetera. It was pretty dark.
How did you manage to, during this time, like you brought in co-founders, you hired employees, you shipped products. How did you do this despite the fact that you were feeling this sinking, trapped feeling? What did you do? Did you put on the mask, or how did it work? Did you share this with anyone else while
I
you were
mean,
doing
these things
this?
are always roller coasters, right? Like there were, I'm talking about the dark moments. There were high moments too. Like, we launch and we're on TechCrunch
Yeah.
and people are downloading the app. It's like, woohoo, people are using it. That's exciting. So they're ups and downs. But yeah, I mean, I probably put on a mask. I could tell the story of the product and what we were trying to do. Um, and sort of tap dance my way through it.
Mm. Now, were there any? So obviously, you learned some negative lessons out of the Chema Labs experience, and obviously, you chose to do something that really was in your blood afterwards, which is wonderful. We'll turn to that in a second. But was there any learning from trudging through that? Was there anything that was a positive lesson that you would learn, or something you're like, you know what, going through this taught me
Um,
this?
I think it taught me something about myself, which is, even in the face of challenge and adversity, like I can go all in. And I was working incredibly hard despite the fact that I didn't love what we were building. Like I was at my personal red line. I was giving it my all. I felt an incredible care of responsibility to our investors and to our employees. And I knew I had a lot in me to give. And
Yeah.
I think that was instrumental later, because I'm like, okay, no matter what I do, I'm going to be at my personal red line. And then the question becomes, okay, where do I really want to direct that?
Yeah, and I think that this really ties into the Boom experience. So obviously, Boom Supersonic is a labor of love. It's also something that a lot of people would say is insane, And I'll get you, a lot of people, not me, but a lot of people would say it's insane because they would say, okay, we tried, supersonic jet flight. The UK and France plunged God knows how much money into the Concorde, and it kind of worked for a while, but never really. And now here you are coming around saying, let's do this again. And it's like, well, how could this possibly make sense? Just like, how could an electric car ever make sense? Or how could private rocketry ever make sense, right? And yet here you are building Boom Supersonic. So what gave you the courage to say, I'm going to ignore all the naysayers and the people who think it can't be done? By the way, I think that those people are crazy because the idea is, oh yeah, we tried something in the 1970s. And obviously, because it didn't work in the 1970s, it could never work out. I'm like, my God, how much has changed since
Right.
then? You people. But what gave you the courage to say, I'm going to do this? Like, did you gradually build up to it, or did you just have that moment where you're like, okay, screw it, I'm
There was
doing
a
it?
gradual buildup and then kind of a moment of decision. A One key element was sort of realizing what we were just talking about. Like, I'm going to be at my personal red line no matter what I do, and I want to choose something where I'm never going to get up in the morning and think, why did I get myself into this, or is it worth it? So that sort of led me to prioritize all my ideas by how happy I personally would be if it worked. And for me, anything with an airplane it went to the top of the list. And it took me a little bit before I really had the courage to say, okay, Blake, I'm going to look at Supersonic. And I thought I would get 2 weeks into the research and uh, understand why it was a bad idea and why no one was doing it. And instead, I just found a whole bunch of stale conventional wisdom. And so I sort of spent a few months kind of getting educated, reading aerospace design textbooks, took an airplane design class, ultimately took a spreadsheet model of the airplane and the market to a professor at Stanford who'd done some supersonics research. And I was like, hey, could you look at this and check my math? Because I've been at this for like 2 seconds. I don't know what I'm doing. But if this is right, I don't understand why no one's doing it. And he looks at it, clicks around. He's like, Blake, if you're going to do this, you should try harder because all your assumptions are conservative. And I remember leaving his office. Right. I remember leaving his office and thinking like either I have no courage or I'm going to make a run at this. And it was a very ego wise, it was a very challenging moment because this is the kind of thing you say, hey, I'm going to build supersonic airplanes. First off, everyone's going to roll their eyes, and it's probably going to fail. Uh, and yet, if you succeed, it's like almost definitionally historic. And so I remember thinking, like, by saying I'm going to go do this, I'm like sort of declaring that I'm in this like club of people who have changed the world when I've really done like nothing so far in my life. I don't have anywhere close to the resume for this. Like, I haven't built and sold a company in a big successful way. I have no background in aerospace, and so I really struggled with it. And I remember thinking, like, what was it like to be Bill Gates before Microsoft was successful, as one example. And at some point, he got up and said, "We're going to put a computer on every desk and in every home running our software," and like that was laughable. But then he went and did it. And the people who set out to do things like that and they succeed, we know their names, and history knows their names. But we know that there's also going to be the dark matter of entrepreneurs, the people who tried to do big things and it didn't work. We don't know who they are,
Yeah.
but they know that they tried and they gave it their all. And what I decided was the only way to know what I could do was to try, and that I would rather try and fail than be 80, 90 years old looking back and saying, hey, I had this big dream. It seemed possible, but I never got it together to give it an attempt. And when I saw it that way, it's like I knew what I had to
Yeah.
do.
It's the and by the way, this ties in with your old Uber boss, Mr. Bezos, who has the regret minimization framework. And you basically looked at it and said, well, shoot, if I'm on my deathbed someday and I didn't try this, I'm going to be so
That's
pissed at
right. I mean, I
myself.
learned a lot from Jeff in my time at Amazon, and that was one of the deepest lessons. And it's really it's guided some of my biggest choices in life.
So you have this idea, I'm going to pursue supersonic flight. And you also sort of described an even more refined mission, right? It's not just about the technology, it's about making the world smaller through speed. how did you go from, hey, let's build a supersonic jet to making the world smaller through speed? Was it a parallel thing? Did you have it from the beginning? Or was it something that sort of evolved over time as you started thinking about those second order
It was
effects?
that notion, that framing was there right from the beginning. I remember in the middle of 2014, I think the company didn't even
Mm.
exist yet. I hadn't really made the decision to found it. And I wrote an essay that I don't think I ever published, that I kind of just wrote for myself, that I called I Feel the Need for Speed. And, but the content of it, the content of it
Top Gun comes
right,
up
you just
again.
can't avoid it, right? But it was not the content was all the opposite of Top Gun, and it was about the importance of in-person human connection. And I had, I think I had the benefit of a front row seat to some important contrasts. Like I grew up very close to my maternal grandfather. When I was young, he was about 90 minutes away. When I was a little bit older, he was 20 minutes away. And I got to spend, so much time with him. Looking back, I think he taught me how to do a cold call because we would like go to door selling vegetables out of his garden. Um, and fast forward a generation, I had three young kids of my own at this point, and they had a grandfather who was also a pretty interesting self-made man, but he lived in Hong Kong. And sadly, he passed last year, having met his grandkids maybe like three or four times. And so, from the kids' perspective, like
Oh, that's sad,
right
heartbreaking.
from the kid's perspective, he's like this weird uncle that no lessons were passed from generation to generation. And the reason is really simple. Like when Hong Kong is 18 hours away, it's just too darn long, especially for the very young or the very old. And I could see very clearly that the difference in my children's experience growing up was how fast the flights were. And so, not everyone has a story exactly like that, but I believe there is something transformative for virtually everybody if more of the planet comes within reach. And the internet did that digitally, and supersonic flight can do it physically. And so, the notion of this is not
Mm.
about speed, it's not about going Mach 2 with your hair on fire, although I find that fun. Uh, it's about connecting with people and experiences.
That's a beautiful vision. I got to ask a couple of specific questions now, just because I'm curious. So you are now located in Denver, Colorado. You grew up in Cincinnati. You worked in Silicon Valley. You worked in Seattle. Why in particular Denver, Colorado?
Uh, I wanted to put the company someplace where we could build a dream team. And tech has relatively few centers. It's Silicon Valley, and there's kind of a distant second. Aerospace, there are people in Seattle, there are people in LA, there are people in Savannah, there are people in Wichita. And I knew I knew to do this, we would need a dream team. And I would need to put the company someplace where a great variety of absolutely fantastic people would be happy to move. And it turns out people love Denver, and people of a lot of different backgrounds love Denver. And so we put the company there, knowing it would be get people to move to. And about 80% of the company relocated to be part of it, and we lose almost nobody over location.
I do like Denver quite a bit myself. I've spent a fair amount of time in Denver, also in Boulder, which is not too far away, and it is a great place. It's just one of those things where I'm like, I never hear about anyone saying, "Yeah, I want to locate my company in Denver," unless they were
Mhm.
already there.
Yeah, it's I wasn't already there, but I talked to we identified the first kind of half a dozen candidates for the first few roles in the company, and there was a whole conversation about, okay, where are we all moving to do this together? And initially I thought the answer would be Long Beach. I'd looked at the Tesla story, and Elon had famously
Hmm.
purchased the NUMMI plant from GM and Toyota for a song and kind of turned that into his factory. And Boeing was shutting down the C-17 plant in Long Beach. And so I thought, well, we'll run the same playbook. We'll buy the C-17 plant for a penny, and we'll turn that into the supersonic jet factory. But what I discovered pretty quickly is that everybody who wants to live in Long Beach already lives there. And I would say Long Beach, and it was just like all the oxygen would leave the room. And so we had this conversation about, okay, well, where would we all go to do this? Um, and by the way, if you want to get your spouse to move to Denver, the best way to do it is convince her she might have to move to Long Beach, and then say, "What do you think about Denver?" And it's like, I'm going.
No. If you Long Beach, you're going to end up living in Santa Monica or Venice, and then go down to Long Beach and make a
It's
miserable commute
totally
every day.
worse. I
That's
mean, you
what ends up
talk
happening, which
about
is even
big
worse in some
important
ways.
missions that somebody should work on, like traffic. Would somebody please start would somebody listening, please start a
Oh,
traffic startup. There's low hanging fruit, and it's a big business.
absolutely. Now, you talk to me about building a dream team, and talk to me about how different it is to recruit people for Boom versus recruiting people for Kima Labs when you have this messianic sort of conviction
I
in
mean,
what you're
there's
doing. Like,
no
how has that been
way
different
I would
for you?
have the quality and the caliber team that I have today if the mission weren't so compelling and so magnetic. When I would tell people, even in the earliest days, I'm building supersonic jets, the people wouldn't always say it out loud, but implicitly the first question was, "Are you crazy?" And if you could convince them the answer was maybe no, then the next question was, how do I help? And in many ways, I got the pick of the best people, and that's and as we've continued to make progress and de-risk the company, the access to talent has just gotten better. And, people talk about companies growing and there being a bozo explosion, and we have sort of the opposite principle of like our talent bar should go up as we grow, and it's actually possible because the mission is so magnetic, and the more it looks like this is really happening, then the more people are willing to bet their careers on it. And today we have just as one example, we basically stole the entire leadership team from Gulfstream from the G6. And so those are the engineers that are now leading the development of the Overture airliner. And I remember when I was recruiting my now CTO almost 3 years ago, he came out to Denver. The first test airplane was still like it was like a bucket of parts in the hangar, and he comes out. And you can tell he wants to believe, but he's not sure. He sort of sticks his head in it. He looks at some of the components we're building. And he's like, "Blake, this is a real airplane." I'm like, "That's right." And then at that moment, I knew I had him.
That's awesome. And I just have to ask, and you can tell us that this is private information, you can't provide it, but you got the team from the G6. And obviously, I know the stated mission of Boom is commercial jetliners, but I got to believe there's a huge business market for this as well. I mean, the number of billionaires who would pay to be able to get to places more quickly. I mean, it feels like that
So
might even
it,
be
it, it
faster
turns
than the
out that
jetliner approach. You
that
must have
sounds
thought about
plausible, but
this.
it's not true. And the reason, yes, the reason is before Boom, the
Interesting.
assumption was exactly what you said. When Supersonic comes back, it's a private jet. It makes sense. This is for people who are ultra wealthy, whose time is most valuable. The product is smaller,
Right.
it'd be easier to build. Like it sounds so believable. But there's one big problem, which is even high end, ultra long range business jets spend 80% of their time over land. And one of the political fallouts from Concord is we have a
Mm.
speed limit over land. It's ostensibly about noise. It should have been a noise limit. Instead, we put a speed limit in place. Thou shalt not exceed Mach 1. It's really, really dumb, but it's ferociously difficult to change. And so the proposition for a supersonic private jet until that's changed is, hey, it's 50% more expensive, it's 50% smaller, it has less range, and it's not faster 80% of the time in real world usage. And so the market for that, you got to get a magnifying glass to find it. It's like a vanity purchase, except for a very small number of cases. And we can see a way to sell a few dozen as private aircraft. And a few dozen aircraft does not justify a multi-billion-dollar development effort. And one of the early insights was that constraint on supersonic flight over land is not a blocker to the commercial model. Because if you go to a United, um, they have a whole bunch of special mission airplanes. They don't fly the same thing from New York to LA that they fly from LA to Sydney. And so if you say, hey, United, I've got an airplane that's really for the routes that are more transoceanic. And so you'll fly at New York to London, you'll fly at Miami to Madrid, you'll fly at Seattle to Tokyo, but you won't fly at Transcon. It's not much better there. They get it, and that fits. And the one of the other lessons there was don't accept qualitative answers to quantitative questions. And is there a market? Is a quantitative question. And so, ironically, in
Mm.
Hawaii in 2014, while my kids were on the beach or in the swimming pool, I was like hacking on a JavaScript Excel market model for supersonic, and it's like, okay, even with that constraint of no supersonic flight over land, there is a massive market for an airliner that's faster.
Got it. And, that makes so much sense. And by the way, the other unstated thing is once there is a supersonic airliner flying the transoceanic routes, the pressure to permit it to go over land will build in a way that it wouldn't if you just had a couple of loud billionaire owners saying, hey, when can I make this thing fly over land instead? Even though, again, as you point out, this is purely a legacy issue. Presumably, you have got the
That's,
engineering
I
in
think that's
place to make it
mostly
so the
true.
noise is
The
not a
noise
factor over
questions
land.
are much harder than I think is widely recognized. There's sort of two noise questions. One is how do you make takeoff and landing quiet for airport communities? And that's actually we've solved that problem.
Hmm.
Airport communities are going to be super excited when Overture comes. It's not going to rattle their windows. But the sonic boom question is tricky because making the airplane quieter comes at an efficiency cost. And and no one knows how quiet is quiet
Mm.
enough. In my opinion, the high quality psychoacoustics research to define acceptability hasn't been done yet. And so we made the decision in Overture 1 not to worry about it. And so it'll be, from a sonic boom perspective, about as loud as Concorde was. And that's okay. We'll put the sonic booms where no one's there to hear them. And then Overture 2, we'll do the research. We will figure out how quiet is appropriate to be friendly to communities on the ground. And then we'll do the engineering work to say, okay, so there's a zone of acceptability, there's a zone of feasibility. It's like a Venn diagram. Let's find where they overlap. Let's build that airplane, and then let's share it with all the
Hmm.
stakeholders
Hmm.
so that everybody on the airplane and everybody below the airplane is excited that this is getting built. But that is a significant effort technically. It's a significant psychoacoustics effort, and it's going to be a significant regulatory and policy effort. And that's down the road. We're not really working on that now.
Got it. Well, we have to now turn the topic to the question of Elon Musk because we mentioned earlier, or I mentioned earlier, electric cars and rocketry, and obviously this is an area that Elon has actually succeeded in building market-leading companies. In some ways, you are the Elon Musk of supersonic aviation. We're not going to call you the Elon Musk of social media or anything else like that. That's a bit more problematic. But having tackled a problem like this, are there any insights you can say about the success of Tesla or the success of SpaceX that other people wouldn't see, but somebody who's been through this, who's been through the
I
wars
probably
himself
wouldn't have
would?
had the courage to start Boom if it weren't for having seen SpaceX succeed. So the inspiration factor, I think, is significant. I think there's a lot of possibility in the world. I think more people can do more bigger things. But we tend to assume, at least I assumed, like, oh, that's not possible. The inspiration of just a success story was huge. And one of my biggest hopes is we can pay that forward and people will think if the internet coupon guy could build a supersonic jet, what can I do? Um, but looking at lessons learned out of SpaceX and Tesla, this is all stuff that Elon says in interviews. I don't know that I have like a secret private insight, but it's not talked about a ton. The ability to learn new things, the ability to switch fields. I believe that skills are far more variable than passion, and knowledge is far more variable than passion. So follow your dreams. Find the thing that you really want to go solve, and then trust that you'll be able to learn it. And I was able to go learn aerospace in like roughly a year. And I remember the first people I met when I was early on in this, and they kind of rolled their eyes, and I came back and talked to them a year later, and they're like, "What happened to you?" It's like somehow you just got it. It's you sound like you've been doing this for 15 years, but like only 12 months went by, and it's all very learnable. And it's learnable very specifically if you focus on first principles and deep understanding of how things really work. And I think this is true in
Hmm.
physics as
Hmm.
much as it's true in economics or finance or any field. There's a literal or metaphorical physics of everything, and it tends to be a small number of simple principles. And if you focus on that and you work at it, you can really understand it. It's incredibly powerful. In some ways, it's far more powerful than being immersed in a field for a decade and knowing so much that you're lost on what is fundamental versus what is derivative.
I love how thoughtful you are, how structured you are in your thinking. And it does not surprise me that my friend and co-author Reid Hoffman's also an investor in Boom. Have you been able to learn any important lessons from working with Reid? I find that,
Oh, I love
I've
Reid. I
learned
mean,
so
Reid has
much
the
from spending
same.
time
I
with
think
him.
it went back way before Boom about starting a startup as like jumping off a cliff and planning to build an airplane on the way down. And I guess we took that literally. Um, but there's, I'm not even sure, where to start. He talks about, importance of just kind of moving with rapidity, building cultures that are cohesive, getting people focused on the same goals, the same way of working. And then maybe this is a fun anecdote. I don't think Boom would exist without LinkedIn. Like, there's no way I could have found my team. Like, literally, all my
Nice.
initial recruiting was done on LinkedIn. And I had when I first went to LinkedIn in 2014, I filtered by first degree connection, industry equals aerospace, and it was nobody, literally nobody. I didn't know a single human in the industry. And my very first meeting was somebody who worked at SpaceX, who played hockey in college, was somebody who'd worked for me at Groupon. And so, talk about second order effects of technology. Like, there wouldn't be a supersonic jet startup if it weren't for LinkedIn.
Hmm. I think it's probably true of a lot of startups. I mean, that is one of the incredible things about Reed's vision for LinkedIn. So, one final sort of two-part fun question, then we'll let you go because you are so busy. You must have so many things to do. The final fun question is this: as an aviation geek, what is your favorite commercial aircraft and what is your
Oh,
favorite
my favorite
military aircraft
commercial
from history?
aircraft. Let's actually start military because it's easier and it's a little cliche-ish, but it's true. The SR-71 Blackbird, and the whole kind of lineage of aircraft that built up to that. I think the
Oh, of
Blackbird is the most
course.
impressive airplane ever built. To make that a reality, Kelly Johnson had to reinvent basically everything: reinvent propulsion, reinvented materials, reinvented manufacturing. He's willing to defy what seemed obvious, like that airplane leaked fuel on the ground, and the fuel tanks can only seal when it got up to speed and got up to temperature. And I just love everything about that story. And yet I find it, it's sad in a way, is we haven't topped that, and that was in the 1960s. And so one of my biggest, long range dreams for Boom is that we'll build something that we'll be able to look and say that was as impressive. And I don't think Overture One clears that bar. But maybe Overture Two, maybe Overture Three, we can get there. And it's a very, very high bar that Kelly Johnson set. Now, if I look back at the commercial side of it, I mean, there have been a lot of great airplanes. And I think, one favorite one is the DC-3, which was really the airliner that made
Of
airlines a
course.
thing. And it was the first airliner that was sold, in the thousands, that probably millions of people benefited from. And you could get across the continent on a DC-3 in under a day. And that sounds cheeky now, but before that, it was like the Transcontinental Railroad, and it took a week. And by the way, before that, it was the Oregon Trail, and it was only a one-way trip. You didn't go back.
You have died of dysentery.
Yeah. Now the joke is we've made
No,
airplane travel,
the
something people dread,
DC-3.
and you die of dysentery from airplane food.
The funny thing about the DC-3 is I actually was just making this point to someone a week or two ago. There is so much incredible technology and so much advancements built into the DC-3 that there is still a company today that just takes the old airframes and remanufactures them and sells them. Like, people are still trying to
Oh
buy
yeah, I mean, I'd love to have a
DC-3s today.
DC-3. It's just so classic. I remember taking my daughter to an air show when she was like 2 years old, and Clay Lacey was flying a DC-3 in the air show. First airplane that she learned. She would just wander around after that, DC-3, DC-3, DC-3. It's a great airplane.
Absolutely. Well, sometime when you're not incredibly busy, we'll have to geek out a bit more about aviation and discuss some of the issues. I can tell you know so much about it, and it's a topic I love as well. But let's get you back to building the world's first commercially successful supersonic jet airliner.
Thank you,
Blake, I
Chris. Enjoyed the
cannot thank you
conversation.
enough. Much appreciated.